Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Atlantic Circle InConversation event titled How to Responsibly Shape Technology's Impact on Society. My name is Magda Joshi. I'm the Events and Alumni Engagement Manager at UWC Atlantic and a member of the Philanthropy, Engagement and Partnerships team. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by 4 UWC Atlantic alumni: Jenny Grinblo from the class of 2006, Dan Jenkins from the class of 2006, Léa Steinacker from the class of 2007, and Eshrat Waris from the class of 2006, who together will take us on a path to the world of technology from a product development, user design, legal, and societal perspectives. I'm truly excited for this very special event that brings together so many diverse alumni, and thank you to the 4 of you for joining us. Before we begin, I just wanted to say a few words of housekeeping. The session will run for about 60 minutes. It is being recorded. For those of you who do not want to appear on the camera as part of the recording, feel free to switch off your camera when asking questions later. We will be looking at turning to your comments and questions towards the second half of the event. So if you would like to comment or ask a question, please use the chat function. We also recommend renaming yourselves so that we know if you are a UWC Atlantic alum, an alum of another UWC, or a friend of the college. It would be useful to also know the year you graduated in. Turning to the core of our today's event, as I said, we are joined by 4 UWC Atlantic alumni. Jenny is the head of user experience and design at London-based Future Workshops. She has led technology projects in healthcare, government, media, sport and finance in the UK, USA, Europe, and the Middle East. Dan is a consulting partner and innovation manager at the new look law firm startup Nexa Law, specializing in both civil and commercial litigation. Léa is a researcher, award-winning journalist, and entrepreneur. Her expertise lies in the origins and effects of socio-technological change. She's the co-founder and COO of ADA, an education platform for personal growth and organizational transformation in the digital age. Eshrat is a product and business strategy specialist who focuses on creating sustainable infrastructure in Bangladesh. She serves as principal, product and business at Soulshare, a startup providing ICT-based services in clean energy, energy efficiency, and e-mobility in rural and urban areas. Thank you very much to the 4 of you for joining us, and I'll now hand over to Léa to take us through to the event. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Magda, and thank you all for joining us. I'm so thrilled to see so many faces and also to see such a diversity of years. I'm really quite impressed. I can see Pelham Allen from AC 69. That's amazing. I love that we are joined by so many interested minds on this topic. So today I'm wearing 2 hats. I'm a journalist on the one hand side and a researcher on the other. So I will try to guide us through the conversation in my journalistic mind, and I'll also try to give some input, but I'm really thrilled to hear from my 3 co-ACers on everything on their experience as well, because we actually come from 4 very different perspectives to the topic of digital technologies. We have a different focus in our work. And I want to make this very interactive if possible. Magda just mentioned the chat. I am very fine with you asking questions throughout. I will keep an eye on the chat and I'll try to either insert your questions when they come up, or I'll make sure to get back to them at the very end. So please feel free to jump in via the chat. And I also want to make sure that what we're discussing today is very tangible for all of you, so that you can really hopefully connect it to your daily life, to your work, or to whatever you do to fill your days. So if there's anything that is either too complex or that we're not explaining very well, please, again, feel free to reach out, feel free to ask a question. And so to get us all on board with the topic of how we are not just surrounded by digital technologies, but how we're actually also shaping them, how we're impacting what they are like for us in our usage, and also how they completely change our daily lives, the way that we work, the way that our politics work. To get us acquainted with what that actually means, I would love to start with a very quick round of the four of us, and to hear what each of you are actually working on. So please, can you give the audience one application that is similar or related to your work that might be familiar to them in their daily life? I'll just go through all of you. Jenny, why don't you start us off? Try to give us one tangible example.
Sure. Thank you, Léa, and thanks for having us, Magda and AC. It's so exciting to be in this great company. So my name's Jenny. I work in user experience. So what that means is I work in technology to make sure that the real people who are using or benefiting from products in the technology space are involved and their interests are represented. So one tangible example that our organization Future Workshops is currently working on is a no-code platform, meaning anyone can create an app. It's called AppRail. And one example for an application of this technology at the moment is that we're working with the NHS, the National Health Service here in the UK. And it's enabling clinicians to build applications together with patients and also coworkers in mind. And one such application that's currently being very successful is called the Freedom to Speak Up. And it's an application that clinicians have built to enable NHS staff to anonymously report concerns. And it's helping to bring things up within the NHS and improve the situation that workers are in, and it's already making an impact within the last few months. And so the idea behind all of this is to make sure that app creation is democratized and people who are working directly with end users can be involved in the creation of technology.
So just to sum up and to understand, Jenny, since you say it needs to be democratized, when you say no code is needed, it means that with this platform, anyone can build an app without actually having to do the computer programming in the background, correct?
That's exactly right. And they can do that within several days or several hours rather than several months without a team and without the need for a big budget, which previously or in many ways still are big impediments to creating technology that serves.
Okay, we'll get back to that point of democratizing and how some digital technologies are democratizing access to certain things. But let's move on to you, Dan. Can you give us an example of what you're working on that is hopefully tangible for the audience?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My input is slightly different to Jenny's in that it's less direct. It's more of an indirect impact that it would have, and perhaps people won't be able to relate to it as much. Working hand in hand as a lawyer, being an innovation manager, is more how our lawyers interact with their clients or how we interact with our lawyers. So I can't really give you an example of an app that may be widely used. I think we would probably be a legal mix of Monzo meets Fiverr. So that's probably the closest I can give you. In terms of direct application with the day-to-day person, we've developed an app to help with KYC. So that's legal speak for Know Your Client. So collecting information such as copies of passports, utility bills, the usual stuff that you'd have to send your lawyer or accountant or whoever you have formal dealings with.
So meaning what you just described as the example, that means the app or the platform helps to collect all of this information on the client, which is something that used to be done by human lawyers, if I understand you correctly, and the system now actually digitizes that entire process of collecting all the material.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, the actual work itself is still very much a traditional way of doing things, which we're looking to change. So lawyer meets client and the usual process is followed. What we're trying to do is digitize that where we can to speed things up, basically, and also help bring costs down for the end client.
So we have another important point here, which is speeding things up, making things more efficient. So we have a lot of digital technologies that try to do exactly that. Jenny brought up the aspect of democratization, giving access to more people, and Dan's example fits nicely into the idea of basically increasing efficiency, or at least many technologies try to. Don't always succeed, but we'll get to that probably. Eshrat, can you give us an example from your work?
Good evening, everyone. So I work in the energy space here in Bangladesh, and energy is very, very political, and it's driven by a lot of regulation. What we do is we're building virtual power plants in Bangladesh, which is our way of trying to decarbonize the economy to as much as possible. Just to give a little bit of background about Bangladesh, most of our power sector, it's all about fossil fuels here. And that was a strategy that the government pursued over the years. I remember growing up in the 90s when only about a third of the population had access to electricity. Today, it's 99%. So it's been a crazy growth that we've had. And along that side, we've had like a very, very massive jump in our GDP growth as well. But it does come with a big cost. And the way we're approaching the solution is actually building virtual power plants by incentivizing people to put up panels and batteries in at their homes, at their place of work. Because in Bangladesh, you can't really put up panels in most lands because all land is required to be used for agriculture. It's a very small country, so food security is a priority. So when you have these kind of tension, like, you need energy for growth, but you need food to survive. How do you make those two work? So what we've done is we've converted households, we've converted charging station infrastructures to provide clean, renewable energy into the ecosystem. And the platform that I'm working on is actually creating a financial incentive because we allow people to trade electricity with each other. So we're trying to create these incentives so that all of these units become interconnected and then become grid connected. So each individual person in a country is actually co-powering the energy future of the country. So it's a very, very audacious idea that we're working with. It is not without its challenges because I'm sure anyone can vouch for it who's working in tech. Hardware is very, very hard.
It is, absolutely. And also, this is a great example for a digital technology that basically tries to change how a system works, how a process that we used to do in society works, right? Oftentimes it's an entire business model that gets changed, but the way that you described it, Eshrat, you're changing an incentive structure and thereby changing how something is provided. In this case, it's energy, right? So let's actually stick with your example because I want to jump into your different perspectives. We have Jenny, who's an expert on user experience, which is more the software and specifically the user-facing side. And then Eshrat, now your focus is on product and on hardware. And Dan really has the sort of legal background and also some of the regulatory institutional boundaries that we can look at. So Eshrat, from your perspective, what are some of the product factors that drive you when you're coming up with how to set up this entire system of incentivizing people to behave quite differently to be able to provide energy?
Cost. Honestly, it just boils down to cost. So how much are people earning? How much can they afford to spend on this product? I mean, we can build the coolest technology out there. I mean, there's some ideas that we've been, toying around with, but when your product starts costing $500, no one is going to pay for that. But you don't want to give them a rickety, crappy product. You want to give people good quality product at a low cost. And unfortunately, cutting edge tech is not cheap. It's really hard. It takes a long time. And I think for us, what's been important is trying to really understand customer psychology. So if we go out and ask someone like, what do you want? What kind of service would you like? A person will ask for the sun and the moon. And obviously we will not be able to deliver all of the things that we want. but it's really trying to understand what is that absolute critical pain point, where is that pain starting from for them, and building a low-cost solution to that, but a quality solution in the process. So it's a matter of, economics coming through. It's a matter of psychology. It is a matter of sociology. All of these different disciplines coming together when we're trying to design a product, because we work with farmers, we work with people who own garages, we work with people who drive rickshaws, right? These are individuals who do not have a high volume of income. But how do you make services, energy services, accessible to them? And it needs to, and the most important thing is you really have to bear in mind their lifestyle, really do a cognitive mapping of how they make their decisions, and based off of that, design the product. I mean, I have enough stories of failures of barking up the wrong tree, but I think those were important lessons for us to really understand that, we weren't asking the right questions, and it's really being able to filter that out and really understand the economics at the very unit level, to then make a decision which path to go when you're trying to build a product. What feature do you want in there? What is kind of a nice to have but not necessary right now?
And before we move on to Jenny's side of things, the user-facing side, I'm also wondering, you're trying to incentivize people to install, if I understood you correctly, panels, so to install quite a large piece of hardware in a way that they did not do previously, right? It was not a need that they saw. They individually had to contribute to the energy provision. How do you either create that need or even provide them with the knowledge, the information that they need in order to understand their part in this? Because the reason why I'm asking is many digital systems have this hurdle, right, to begin with, how to communicate to customers, citizens, that there even is a need for what you're building.
Honestly, I mean, just to start off, Bangladesh is a little bit of an outlier in the sense that solar home systems already existed when we came into the market. So we never really had to go through that process. But where we came in was getting people to trade. So what we've seen over the years is that if you own solar home systems and then a national grid comes, your asset remains stranded or it becomes stranded overnight, but these systems have a very long lifetime. They have a 20-year lifetime. So what do you do with these stranded assets? No one's going to throw away their panels and batteries because they're good assets to have. And what we've found is that when you have something like batteries, right, which can provide grid services, so stabilization services to the grid, because where the solar home systems exist, they're at the edge of the national grid. And this is where you have a lot of power outages. But when you have batteries on this side, where we have our microgrids, and you interconnect them with a national grid, whenever there's voltage issues or power outage issues, you can actually draw the power from the batteries from these that are just lying unused right now. So, but the challenge over here is finding the right tariff, right? People need to be incentivized that, okay, I've invested in these batteries. Am I getting the value for these batteries that it makes sense for me to, push electricity in the national grid or take excess from the national grid into my batteries? So it's really, it just boils down to like, is this price worth it for someone? Are they getting the right pricing? And this is where it kind of comes into regulation, right? So for us, when I said earlier, it's political, it's very regulatory, we have to work with the government. I know with a lot of tech startups that you want to bypass the government at all costs, make things, break things. Well, we can't. One of our strongest partners and advocate, and also at times someone who drives us up the wall and makes us go crazy, is the government. Because when we're talking about providing these new solutions, or like innovative solutions, they need to be the partner, because if they do not provide that tariff for these households, there is no incentive, right? We're almost a power management company for all purposes. But then we also need to get into this policy regulatory space to enable that to happen.
Well, that couldn't have been a more perfect segue. First of all, to you, Dan. I'll get to you, Jenny. You're the end point. You're the customer point, of course. But Dan, I mean, Eshrat made some really good points here about the impact, really, and the importance of the regulatory boundaries that any digital system, just like many other products, any other product even, operate in. And you know, if we look back even at the last year, I don't know how many of you heard about the EU draft regulation that came out in April of last year. It was the first worldwide, if it is passed into law, will be the first worldwide binding AI regulation. So a regulation on artificial intelligence. It was incredibly comprehensive. It was actually very far reaching. It provided such categories such as high-risk systems, which would mean that in the EU, certain platforms that are functioning today, that are running and are very successful today, including, by the way, Facebook, could actually be classified as a high-risk system, and they could be banned if the EU Innovation Board decides to do so. So it was actually a huge step. This was April of last year. In the years before that, we saw a long period where systems were being put out into the world without anyone actually understanding them enough or regulating them enough to give them any kind of boundary, really. So Dan, with your experience, when we think of the legal realm, we often think of thresholds and boundaries, right? Can you give us some examples of where the law might have a huge impact on how platforms, systems, digital devices, apps are actually working for all of us today?
I think it's important that we start by facing the truth, which is there's a reason not many people like lawyers. And that is because we put up horrendous amounts of red tape and make life very difficult. And I think Eshrat did very well reining it in when she was talking about the regulator. So I think it's important to understand that we lawmakers are typically the brake that is applied to innovation. I think it's important that we do act as the brake, which we'll come on to in a moment. But with technology developing so quickly, it's impossible for the law to get ahead of technology at all, I think. Even if it were to, it would be very, very temporary. So I don't think the legal framework is the driver, but it's more developing how much we can let off the brake to allow innovation to push forward. I think a good example of that, and the pun here is very much intended, would be the self-driving cars. This is something that I think everyone has become familiar with in the last few years, especially with Tesla. There's so many interesting legal questions that are being asked alongside ethical, because there's a very close tie between ethics and law, although they do deviate. The most obvious would be what happens if there's an accident, and the self-driving car was the one that was in control of the car. Who's culpable? So I know that legislation is being looked at the moment, and regulators are saying, well, actually, it's the either the software provider or the manufacturer that ought to be held accountable. But at what point does that flip? So these are the types of questions that we need to ask behind the scenes, and we can't really ask them until we understand the capabilities of the technology that we're dealing with. So I think, just to answer your question, it's very difficult to see where law is going to be the driver. It's more trying to refrain things from getting out of hand, especially with automation or artificial intelligence. We're creating something that effectively thinks for itself. So without any external input from a human, who is culpable for decisions that program makes? Who does the victim turn to in a civil case or a criminal case? So it's very interesting, these types of questions. And I do think it's extremely important that legislation is made before any further developments get out of hand. But equally, I think there needs to be a very hard look at the way that we do develop legislation, because otherwise the rate of technology is only going to ever increase. And if the movement of law moves as slowly as it is now, there's going to be a problem later on, I think, in trying to get an effective balance between using these technologies as and when for the greater good, and also developing laws just to safeguard everybody.
You brought up a few points I think that are really important to keep in mind. Number one, technology has usually developed much faster than the law, than regulators have been able to wrap their minds. Also, your second point around what the technology actually is able to do, how it works. It is incredibly complex, especially when we're talking about deep learning methods, which is a sort of subsection of artificial intelligence. And many developers even call those systems a black box because you can't actually completely trace back what has happened. And so if we're getting to that point where regulators are really struggling to understand what basically they are regulating at heart, then that's something we need to keep in mind. On the other hand, I like your example of the self-driving cars because it brings us to a point where I think we become very aware of the human rules we have so far applied. So when we take your example of, who should be held responsible in the case of a death caused by a self-driving car, we might say, well, it should be the software providers, but in a way, it is possible that the software providers actually built a machine that was much, much more accurate and efficient than a human ever could have been. And yet we still feel that it is their responsibility, even though they probably improved the process of driving, because we've seen this in studies. The amount or the ratio of accidents is actually much, much smaller than when a human drives a car. And still we feel like there must have been something basically wrong with the system, or at least there must be responsibility put into the system. And it's kind of interesting because humans are so faulty. We make so many mistakes. That's why we say that's human, to be that imperfect. And yet we would like to not have that responsibility if an AI is involved. So it's a very interesting example. Jenny, you're the one who then deals with what the product actually looks like, what it feels like, and what it triggers in people. What kinds of user experience considerations really drive you when you're trying to understand what impact will this have once people actually see this product and use it?
I think what's really important to think about before we think about how people use technology is how people view technology. And we, myself and us here on the panel, are in the privileged position to understand a little bit about how technology is made. So Léa, you touched on the fact that AI is so complex. There's a very thin and unclear boundary between the human input that's put into AI and then what AI does. It doesn't mean that we can take away responsibility from companies that do develop AI. We know, and we've seen plenty of examples where the artificial intelligence needs to be taught by using information from the world, and the information given to it can be extremely biased. It can be biased in terms of what pictures are shown to a system that needs to be able to recognize a face. There were issues with self-driving cars, or questions around if the developers are all white and they're not using photos of people with darker skin tones, will the AI of a self-driving car know to recognize a brown person as a person on the road? So these are things that we must hold people accountable, regardless of the fact that the AI can then become more complex than a human may be able to program in such a direct way. But when we think about how people use technology, there's a lot of sort of confusion still about how technology is made. Dan talked about regulation and how it can't be the be all and end all of how technology is developed for users. And we've seen that example with Facebook being questioned by the US government. And the questions that came up as a technologist were frankly ridiculous to watch. They were asking questions about how Google serves up search results to people, and the understanding of the people asking the questions was that there's literally a person there who says, oh, Léa asked to see a restaurant, what restaurant should I show her? They didn't understand the complex algorithms behind it. So when we think about how people are using technology and how it impacts them, one of the things to think about is who is actually designing and building the technology. So even though I work in user experience, which means I have information in my mind and experience about how to make a button look visible, how to make information clear on the screen, how to think about accessibility for people with vision or auditory challenges that need information displayed in a different way, we need to take a step back before thinking about the interface that we see and interact with on our device, and think about who actually decided what goes into the technology, who decided what it can do, who decided what information is shown, how it responds to the end user. And when we're talking about ethics and we're talking about positive impact, the people who are best positioned to make those decisions and to make systems that work for the end user are the end users themselves, or the people who are directly serving them. So in the example of the National Health Service, the clinicians are going to know their colleagues and they're going to know the patients better than I would, no matter how many years I've had in design, and no matter how many years my colleagues have had developing systems. But oftentimes there's a big gap between the technology makers and their incentives, which are primarily profit, whether we like it or not. We live within a capitalist system and companies need to make money. And then between the people on the ground who are interested in lives being improved, or processes being easier, or things working faster. And when the gap becomes bigger and bigger, that's when we're beginning to see a lot of these ethical conundrums coming up. Because when we are expecting sort of top-down regulation to catch up with technology, but meanwhile, the folks building the technology are thinking about, we're calling it KPIs, key performance indicators. Do more people sign up to Facebook every month? Does it make more ad revenue? And they're completely detached from the people using it and the information that they're seeing and how it impacts them. Then we're starting to see a big mismatch, and the impact of the technology then is at a high risk of becoming troublesome. And we have seen many examples where it has been. So I haven't directly answered your question, Léa, because I think there's, before we talk about sort of how do we make something easy to use or pleasurable to use, we need to think about what are we actually building and why, and how do we make sure that thing doesn't cause more harm than it does good.
Thank you. It's totally fine not to answer a question directly when one goes on such a very informative tangent. I really like it, especially because I think you tied together some issues that you also mentioned at the very beginning when you said, the user experience is really there to represent many users' interests. And that was your example of, the communities who are not represented when those people designing these systems don't consider that they need to be included. So don't consider diverse representation. That's number one. And you brought in the business models, incredibly important in these digital technologies. You mentioned the example of Facebook. I could not agree more with you. For anyone who would like to see what it looks like when a US congressman does not know what they are speaking of, I really recommend the testimony, the very first testimony of Mark Zuckerberg a few years ago, when the questions were so basic, I can only equate them to, car regulators asking, and how exactly does the wheel turn, Mr. Zuckerberg? Really, anyone who had knowledge of Facebook was watching this kind of shocked that that was the level of knowledge. And so you pointed all of this out, Jenny, very nicely. And I want to bring in 2 points from the audience. Number one, Ruth has just asked, are there any efforts to standardize ethical requirements to protect end users and communities and societies? Thank you, Ruth. Very, very important point. And yes, there are multiple efforts. And I love that you asked about this, because I actually looked at some of these efforts and frameworks in my doctoral research recently. And I see many different efforts coming from companies themselves. For example, Google has an ethical AI framework. Facebook has an ethical research group, right? They are all now saying, because they do have to, towards the outside at least, they are saying that we are looking at various dimensions, various categories of this. But I think more importantly, there are also various institutions looking at exactly that, to standardize ethical considerations, protection issues. You might see the GDPR regulation, the General Data Protection Regulation of 2016 that the EU put into law in May 2016. You might see that as one step that was actually hailed across the world. If you talk to US researchers, they're saying, we wish we had something as clear and comprehensive as the GDPR, or at least use it as a blueprint. You might see that as a first step to protect end users when it comes to their data being used. So that's number one. There are multiple institutional efforts to standardize. What I found in my research, though, is that number one, they are really diffuse. So it is really difficult because the companies are using terms that, of course, the international institutions aren't necessarily using. I also think it's difficult when we're starting to use very binary thresholds. So some of these frameworks are putting out thresholds such as responsible AI, so responsible artificial intelligence, or trustworthy or fair. And I believe in the general intention here, but it is incredibly hard to look at one system. Let's take Facebook. Well, actually, Facebook, I think it's very easy. There are some aspects of, let's say, Amazon, where you might question, well, you know, some parts of that company are definitely not fair, but does it technically sort fairly? Maybe we would have to go into the algorithms to see that. So it's, I think, too simplistic to say it is either that or the other. So what I would suggest is this framework, and I hope maybe this can help you all to think through it in 4 dimensions, actually. And actually, Jenny and Eshrat and Dan have pulled in many of these points, but maybe it might help you in the future to go through these 4. So I call it code capital, kind of like we have social capital to express the potential of our connections, or human capital to express our knowledge and our education, or of course, financial capital. But what I consider to be code capital are 4 dimensions for the acronym CODE, so the word code. And number 1, the C stands for conception. So you have to ask yourself, how was the system conceived? Jenny just brought up Facebook. Let's take Facebook as a good example. The system was conceived, supposedly, the narrative was, we want to connect people. We just want that they can talk to each other and share photos. But you also have to ask yourself, how was it conceived? Jenny brought this up, with the business model in mind. They said we want to connect people. What they did is also, in addition to connecting people, selling their data. So that is how the system very simplistically now has been set up. So that's the first dimension. What is it supposed to do, this digital technology? And what are really the mechanisms behind these goals? The second dimension, the O, stands for operations. This is what Eshrat has talked about, what Jenny has also brought in. How is what they said they would do translated? How is it operationalized? What does the thing look like? What is the user interface that Jenny was designing? What does the hardware look like that Eshrat put a lot of thought into, right? How does it operationally look? And then the D, very important, stands for data. You have to ask yourself, where's the data coming from? Is it fairly representing people? How has it been cleaned and sorted? And the last dimension brings in Dan's perspective. The E of the code framework stands for the environment. So this is anything in the environment of that digital technology that gets impacted. So for example, does it actually adhere to laws, to existing legal norms, or does it completely change them? Does it completely upend how politics works? In the case of Facebook, suddenly political parties can pay for advertisement on this platform without having to tell anyone that it's a paid for advertisement. This is new on TV, at least in the United States, and in Europe, you have to actually say this was paid for by a political party. So how is it impacting the environment? Those 4, conception, operations, data, and environment. If you go through these, you get, I think, a more nuanced and not such a binary understanding of what these technologies do. And again, my 3 colleagues have just brought in all of these points basically, but maybe the categories help you. I wonder if
can I just interject?
Please.
Is that okay? So when we're talking about standardizing the requirements and the ethical requirements to protect end users, what we need to ask ourselves is who is going to enact those standards, even if it were possible to standardize those requirements today and it had been standardized, who is actually going to enact them? And I'm going to reveal a bit my personal life here. 9 weeks ago, Dan and I had a baby. And I'm thinking about parenting a lot. And I want to suggest an analogy to think about the regulation of the ethics of technology versus the making of technology, a bit like parenting. So creating technology and building it and designing it and running it and operationalizing it and making money from it is a bit like raising a baby versus the body trying to regulate it is like social services. There's a lot more complexity, a lot more long-ranging day-to-day decisions that are made when technology is created that require organizations and teams that are responsible for that technology to be motivated and to want to act ethically in order for that technology to ever have a chance of having positive bill. And social and say, hey, I've done something wrong here, to really go back to that conception, to that operational business model and rethink. So then we're stuck and we have to ask ourselves, do we take the parents? And it's just not enough. So I think when we're all together in communities like this, thinking about how technology is made, and when we have organizations like Atlantic College or UWC educating people and encouraging folks to want to inherently act ethically, and those people then go into technology, I think that's when technology truly has a chance. I'm just getting a message that you guys can't, that I'm turning into a robot. That's very funny, actually, because we're talking about tech. Is my connection really bad?
Maybe you're an artificial intelligence and will reveal it to us
Artificial
now.
intelligence. I'm a bot. This is a good time. Did that make any sense? I don't know if you guys heard me. The message was people need to want to act ethically and to build ethical organizations. It's not enough to come back at the end when things are built and try and fix it.
Yes, and since you brought up this AC community, I would love to, first of all, give a reminder to everyone in the audience, please do use the chat. I love the examples and questions. And I'll also ask at the very end if there are any lasting questions, but I want to bring in the notion of the AC community and how it might have impacted us in our journey to where we ended up with technology. So Eshrat, can you reflect on, since Jenny just said, you know, a community like this one is especially well suited because we are often, you know, diverse and coming in with a diverse perspective, at least on all of these issues. How has your AC journey, if it did, impacted the fact that you ended up in product design?
I think so there's something I will never forget from my time at AC. I think it was in one of our first weeks there, and Malcolm was the principal, and there were two words he said, and it just became something of a mantra at some point. Like he said, I think it was Malcolm who said it, or maybe it was someone else. Challenge yourself, right? It's put yourself out there, get yourself into a very uncomfortable space where you don't want to be, because that's where you will thrive the most. So for me, I personally don't come from an engineering background. I trained in the social sciences, and then stumbled eventually into energy. And for me, I think it was painful. I can tell you, like my first week at a startup that does energy services, I was standing there being like, what is a kilowatt hour? And wishing to God I'd taken physics at AC, and trying to remember how to do calculus again. And but I think what was important for me to understand over time was that, you know, everyone has a role to play. I'm not there as an engineer. I'm there because the perspective that an education like, you know, Atlantic College provides, it's one that's very holistic. It is comprehensive. By its very design, it doesn't let you specialize on one specific subject. You have to take them all. And you have to put yourself out there in terms of doing services, being involved in different activities. And, you know, you're really being pushed in different areas. You're meeting people who are coming from very, very different cultural contexts than you, with very different perspectives, political, social, and yet at the same time, you're also trying to form a community there. And translating that back into building products. I mean, for us, the communities that we work in, we're trying to create an ecosystem, right? We're really trying to change the way power is generated, the way power is consumed, and really changing the energy mix in Bangladesh. And to be able to do that, you really need to understand where the incentives lie at each and every layer of the ecosystem. Things that may not seem connected, but they are. You need to understand, for me, I spend a lot of time these days thinking about supply chain. And probably not the only person who thinks about supply chain. Anyone who's in manufacturing is probably feeling that pain right now, or food. But I think an education like Atlantic College is one where you learn to work with people who are coming in from very, very different perspectives. You may have a big grand agenda, like, you want to, I don't know, we all want to build virtual power plants, but I think, some of the points that were raised earlier, who is responsible when the tech doesn't work? If someone's battery gets destroyed, is it me as the metering company who's liable for it? Or is it the national grid who then, who messed up with the voltages and then that had an impact on me? How do you trace back on the responsibility? So I think, we're grappling with those questions, or even when we're trying to make decisions about, if our tech needs to be powered up, right? How much of that power should be paid for by the consumer, or how much of that power should be borne by us? What happens when our customers are from very, very poor communities? How much of my profit margin should I give away? So, or how much profit should I be making over here? Because, if you're the only player in town, the desire to be a monopoly is quite strong. But on the other hand, if you're the only player, like, people don't want to use your technology because they're like, I have nothing to compare you with. Why should I use you? Nobody else is using you. So I think I think that it gets really interesting the minute we start having these conversations around how do we price this product and for whom? And are we okay? Or where is the line at which we do not compromise? Because, for example, the team that I work with, half of the team is German, the other half is Bangladeshi. And, we definitely do not see eye to eye on what an energy transition looks like. I might be stereotyping over here, forgive me for this, but speak to a German and they would be very, very anti-nuclear. They will not be comfortable with nuclear at all. And then you have these other two people in the room being like, well, it's clean power. Like, what is wrong with that? Why can't we have this conversation? So, it gets contentious, but it's finding a way of navigating through those conversations, which, when you're 16 at Atlantic College, definitely gives you a little bit of a head start trying to have these conversations later on in life.
This German over here was very curiously listening to you. But yes, I think the point on cultural understanding that you're making, trying to refer back to your time at AC, I think is a very valid one, because you also mentioned, needing to understand local communities to really get at the impact of a digital technology there, or even the possibility to actually implement it at scale. And it connects to something that a member of the audience is also asking about. Arden Kwan asked, if a technology is developed for global use, how should the advocacy process be to account for the very different environments? So a social psychology or legal realms, and the pain points are different between, say, China and the EU. Really great question, Arden. And actually, for those of you who are interested, I've done some research on the social acceptance of an example that Jenny brought up, which is facial analysis. Jenny brought up the example of facial recognition technology working differently for people with different skin colors, right? And the topic of facial recognition, or facial rec as it's called, is actually a huge one across the world because it is so differently perceived. And we did a paper comparing 4 countries. And for anyone who's interested, I'm going to post it in the chat here. We did a paper comparing China, the UK, the US, and Germany, in how they react to the idea of facial recognition being used in the public sphere. So as you can imagine, and since Arden brought up the comparison here as well, as you can imagine, in China, the association with this technology is completely different. It's to increase security, it increases convenience. I feel much safer if we have our streets surveilled by facial recognition. In Germany, as you can imagine, with our history of surveillance, very different associations. And the US and the UK are interestingly sort of in between, the UK with London being one of the most CCTV'd cities in the world, actually. I think only followed by two, or only preceded by two cities in China. The UK is kind of an interesting case, having been in the UK, in the EU, sorry, previously. But you can really see, maybe in the paper, you can find some of these factors that drive a very different adoption, very different acceptance around the world. So Arden, really good point. You have to really look at the different cultural settings and where you are entering either a market or a community very, very differently. I would love to, maybe in the last few minutes, Dan and Jenny, how would you say has either the AC community during your time or also since then, in terms of maybe, was there mentorship from AC colleagues who might have guided you in those directions or who've helped you along the way, since we also want to just sort of point out that the community, the AC community is for exactly that, for information exchange as we're doing it now and for discussion, but also mentorship along the way. Has that played a role for you too?
Jen, do you want to jump in first?
Sure. One really big way in which I think AC and UWC in general has affected me and changed the way that I work is that, I hope it's still the case, but when we were at AC, everything in the after school hours was run by students. And when you're 16 and you're asked to take responsibility and ownership of your extracurricular life, and not only for yourself, but I think as second years and even first years, we're running clubs for others. One of the folks who ran the photography club is here, who was my second year. He's German as well. I think he knows who we're talking about. And I think it teaches you at a very young age to take responsibility and ownership of your community and of your interests. It teaches you to be active. It teaches you to be a maker and a change recipient or a sort of a prop really in your education. And when I went into the commercial space, even though, I didn't end up in a career path that is a lot more UWC like, or at least was in my mind at the time, I did go into, into technology. Happy to say, it's a private company that makes money. I'm not, changing the world on a very direct way. But what it did is it made me think about how do I take responsibility within our organization. So when I saw that we were having these kind of questions, where the technology space was going, I was empowered to say, hold on a second, what are we doing about this? So I worked with our CEO to start an ethical risk assessment process within our company and to really start that rather than kind of sit there and expect things to be done for me. And I think being within organizations and having the mindset that AC has helped to instill in us, or at least has helped to support within us, means that the right questions and the right intentions and sort of the right willingness to take responsibility is spread within the economy and is spread within organizations. I think that's really important. And as for mentorship, I will never, ever forget the fact that I went to AC thanks to someone who fundraised for my scholarship, who couldn't afford it herself, but she went out of her way to create the funds for me to have this opportunity. So it has truly made me feel a lifelong commitment to offering mentorship and to offer support and to answer questions. And I think we have on the line here someone I met today who's a design student and didn't really know how to even get into technology, and just inviting people into the process and demystifying tech and demystifying success and being a senior person and an expert. I think all of that comes from the AC mentality. I think you have to have humility that you get from meeting people from hundreds of countries to take responsibility for the fact that truly no one really knows what they're doing. I don't know what everyone is does in their professional life here. I see folks from various years, but I'm sure whatever profession you're in, you'll know that no one really knows. No one's really an expert. We do our best. I think before AC, I had the idea that someone else might know more than me, so I should sort of sit back. but actually everybody has to speak up and everybody has to take ownership. And I think that's the way that the change can happen and has to happen in technology specifically, but overall in society.
Dan, do you have anything to add?
Oh, Jenny stole everything I was going to say. So
just like in our marriage, Dan.
Yes, exactly.
I speak over you.
The only thing I would add to that is, even though I've not had direct mentorship through AC, I've spoken with a lot of my co-years or first years, second years, about different things, maybe in the profession or business related. And it's always been a very supportive response. So I would say for anyone listening that is interested in the mentorship program, I would most certainly encourage it.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for adding that. And I would agree. I've also perceived the AC community to be incredibly supportive. Also exemplified by Ross, who is already concerned about your baby, Dan and Jen. He is asking who's looking after the baby, which is our last question for today.
I knew I'd forgotten something. All right, let me pop out.
She's revising her ethics textbooks in the background.
She's already designing her first app. Let's be real. She's already in the digital space. Well, being German, I'm not just relatively averse to nuclear power, but also to, not keeping the time. I'm very mindful of all of your time. So I want to make sure that we land on 6 p.m., which is the time that I have here. I think it's very different times for all of you where you are. But I really hope that you got some new insights of today, that you found our examples tangible and maybe informative. And yeah, I would love to hear from all of you through the evaluation form that Magda just sent around. If you're interested in talking more with any of us, I'm happy for Magda to send out our contact details if you're interested in anything that we're doing, at least for me. I obviously cannot speak for the three other panelists, but yeah. Thank you so much, to Dan, Eshrat, Jenny, to all of you. This was lovely. And Magda, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Léa, for so masterfully taking us through this exciting conversation. It was fantastic to hear all the insights and to listen to to your engaging questions as well. So thank you very much, Léa, for that, and thank you to Eshrat, Jenny, and Dan for your fantastic contributions. I think each of you brought a very different dimension to this conversation. So it was just really inspiring to hear your thoughts and professional and personal experiences as well. I'm seeing a lot of really positive comments in the chat, so do make sure to have a look. As Léa's mentioned, I have just posted a link to our feedback form. So for everyone here in the audience, please do let us know what you thought about today's session and if there are any other aspects that you are interested in to hear about in the future. The Atlantic Circle in Conversation series is a monthly series of events, so do look out for invites for our next events, which we usually promote by email and on social media. And we hope that you will join us. If, as Léa mentioned, if you have any questions for our today's speakers, I will be very happy to convey them. So do get in touch with the college if you have any questions or feedback. Thank you once again to our guest panelists, and thank you to the audience for joining us.